Murder in the Vineyard. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Tony Middleton was elbow deep in a bag of crisps, his textbook precariously balanced on his knees, when Sally Cartwright burst into his dorm room without knocking. As usual. "Tony, put the snacks down and listen to this," she exclaimed, waving a letter like a flag. Tony sighed, brushing crumbs off his shirt. "If this is about another one of your conspiracy theories, Sal, I'm not falling for it. I still haven't recovered from the aliens built the library debacle." Sally rolled her eyes and plopped onto his bed. "This is serious. Javier sent this letter. His uncle owns a vineyard in Spain, and he's invited us to stay for the holidays. All expenses paid." Tony blinked. "Spain? As in actual Spain? With tapas and siestas and wine?" "Yes, Tony, actual Spain," Sally said, grinning. "No more soggy cafeteria food for us. We're talking sun, sangria, and a free vacation." Tony hesitated, his natural skepticism kicking in. "What's the catch? Is Javier's uncle some kind of eccentric billionaire who's going to make us solve riddles for our dinner?" Sally laughed. "No, but even if he is, it'll be fun." "Come on, Tony. When was the last time we did something exciting? You've been holed up in this room for weeks, and I'm starting to worry you're turning into a hermit crab." Tony glanced around his cluttered dorm room, which was, indeed, starting to resemble a crustacean's shell. "Fine," he said, relenting, "but only if I get to pack my survival kit." Sally groaned. "Not the survival kit again. Tony, we're going to a vineyard, not the Amazon rainforest. You don't need a machete and a first aid manual." "You never know," Tony said defensively. "What if we get lost in the Spanish countryside, or attacked by a rogue bull, or you trip over your own shoelaces and need a bandage?" Sally interrupted, smirking. "Relax, Tony. I'll handle the itinerary. You just focus on not overpacking." 2 weeks later, Tony and Sally found themselves on a plane to Spain, Tony clutching his overstuffed backpack like a lifeline. "I still think you're underestimating the importance of a good multi-tool," Tony muttered as the plane descended. "And I still think you're overestimating the likelihood of an apocalypse," Sally shot back, adjusting her sunglasses. "Now, stop fidgeting. We're about to land in paradise." The airport in Malaga was a whirlwind of noise and colour, and Tony immediately regretted not brushing up on his Spanish. Sally, on the other hand, was in her element, confidently navigating the crowds and flagging down a taxi. "To the Castillo Vineyard, please," she told the driver, her accent impressively close to flawless. Tony raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you speak Spanish?" "Since I bought a Learn to Speak Spanish book last week," Sally said, grinning. "You should try it sometime. It's called Preparation." Tony muttered something under his breath about show-offs and settled back in his seat, staring out the window as the taxi wound its way through the picturesque countryside. Rolling hills dotted with olive groves and vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see, and the air was warm and fragrant. When they finally arrived at the vineyard, Tony's jaw dropped. The estate was a sprawling masterpiece of whitewashed walls, terracotta roofs, and lush gardens. A fountain sparkled in the courtyard, and the scent of blooming jasmine filled the air. "This is fantastic," Tony said, momentarily speechless. "Told you it would be worth it," Sally said smugly. They were greeted at the door by Javier, their college friend, who looked more relaxed than they'd ever seen him. "Tony, Sally, you made it!" Javier exclaimed, pulling them both into a hug. "Welcome to Castillo Vineyard. My uncle's been looking forward to meeting you." As if on cue, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a commanding presence appeared in the doorway. "Ah, you must be Tony and Sally," he said, his voice warm but with an edge of formality. I am Don Rafael Castillo. Welcome to my home. Tony shook his hand, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his crumpled shirt and overstuffed backpack. Thank you for having us, sir. Your vineyard is incredible. Don Rafael smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm glad you think so. Please, make yourselves at home. Dinner will be served shortly. As they followed Javier inside, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The grandeur of the estate was undeniable, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Sally, however, seemed oblivious. This is going to be amazing, she whispered to Tony as they were shown to their rooms. Sun, wine, and no responsibilities. What could possibly go wrong? Tony glanced around the opulent hallway, his survival instincts tingling. Famous last words, Sal. Famous last words. Little did they know their holiday was about to take a turn neither of them could have predicted. Chapter 2. A warm welcome. The guest room Tony was shown to was large, with a 4-poster bed that dominated the space, draped in crisp white linens, and the floor was covered in a plush rug that felt like walking on clouds. A balcony offered a breathtaking view of the vineyard, the rows of grapevines stretching out like green ribbons under the golden Spanish sun. Tony dropped his backpack on the bed with a thud and immediately began unpacking his survival kit. Out came the multi-tool, the first aid manual, a torch, a roll of tape, and, Sally's personal favourite, a collapsible fishing rod. You do realise we're not on a desert island, right? Sally said, leaning against the doorway, her arms crossed. You never know, Tony replied, unrolling a map of the local area. What if we need to fish for dinner? Or navigate by the stars? Or you just like being over-prepared? Sally interrupted, smirking. Relax, Tony. We're here to enjoy ourselves, not go away on a sea voyage to Africa. Tony ignored her and continued unpacking, muttering something about better safe than sorry. Sally shook her head and left him to it, retreating to her own room to freshen up before dinner. An hour later, Tony and Sally reconvened in the grand dining room. The long wooden table was set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses, and a chandelier overhead cast a warm, golden glow. Don Rafael sat at the head of the table, his posture regal, while Javier chatted animatedly with a striking woman in her late 20s. Tony, Sally, this is my cousin, Isabella, Javier said, introducing them. Isabella was every bit as glamorous as the rest of the estate, with sleek dark hair, a designer dress, and a smile that hid deep secrets. She nodded at them politely, but said little, her attention seemingly elsewhere. It's a pleasure to meet you, Tony said, extending a hand. Isabella shook it with the faintest hint of a grimace, as though touching him might somehow tarnish her perfectly manicured nails. Sally, ever the social butterfly, immediately tried to engage Isabella in conversation. So, do you live here at the vineyard, or are you just visiting? I live here, Isabella replied curtly. For now. Before Sally could press further, Don Rafael cleared his throat, signalling the start of dinner. The staff, a small army of uniformed servers, began bringing out dishes, plates of cured ham, bowls of olives, and a steaming paella that made Tony's mouth water. As they ate, Don Rafael regaled them with stories about the vineyard's history, his voice rich with pride. The Castillo family has been producing wine here for over a century, he said. Our Tempranillo is renowned throughout Spain. Tony, who knew next to nothing about wine, nodded along politely, though his attention was divided between the food and the odd dynamics at the table. Isabella seemed tense, her eyes darting toward her uncle whenever he spoke, while Javier was unusually quiet, picking at his food. Sally, meanwhile, was in her element, asking Don Rafael endless questions about the winemaking process. So, How do you decide when the grapes are ready to harvest? She asked, her enthusiasm undimmed by the awkward atmosphere. Don Raphael smiled. It's a matter of taste and experience, he said. The grapes must be perfectly balanced. Sweet, but not too sweet. It's an art, really. Tony, feeling out of his depth, decided to focus on the food. He reached for a piece of bread, only to accidentally knock over his glass of wine. The red liquid spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, spreading like a bloodstain. There was a collective intake of breath, and for a moment the room was silent. Then Don Raphael chuckled, though the sound was more strained than amused. No harm done, he said, signalling for a server to clean up the mess. Tony, his face burning, muttered an apology. Sally shot him a sympathetic look, but couldn't quite hide her amusement. As the meal progressed, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency, but their expressions were tense, and they avoided eye contact with Don Raphael. Isabella barely touched her food, her gaze fixed on the window, while Javier seemed to be forcing his cheerfulness. When dessert was served, a decadent flan drizzled with caramel, Sally leaned over to Tony and whispered, "Do you get the feeling we've walked into a telenovela?" Tony nodded, his eyes darting around the table. "Yeah, and I'm pretty sure we're the comic relief." After dinner, Don Raphael excused himself, citing business to attend to, while Javier offered to show Tony and Sally around the vineyard. They stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. "So, what's the deal with your uncle?" Sally asked as they strolled through the rows of grapevines. "He seems intense." Javier hesitated, his usual easygoing demeanour faltering. "He's a complicated man," he said finally. "The vineyard is his life. He's very protective of it." "And Isabella?" Tony asked. "She doesn't exactly seem like the warm and fuzzy type." Javier sighed. "Isabella. Well, let's just say she and my uncle don't always see eye to eye. She's been trying to convince him to modernise the vineyard, but he's resistant to change." Sally raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like there's some family drama brewing." "You have no idea," Javier muttered, though he quickly plastered on a smile. "But enough about that. Let's enjoy the evening." As they continued their tour, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder several times, but the vineyard was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. When they finally returned to the house, Tony and Sally said goodnight to Javier and retreated to their rooms. "Well, that was interesting," Sally said as they stood in the hallway. "Yeah," Tony agreed. "I just hope interesting doesn't turn into dangerous." Sally laughed. "Relax, Tony. What's the worst that could happen?" As Tony closed the door to his room, he couldn't help but feel that they were on the brink of something far bigger and far more dangerous than a simple holiday. And for once, his survival kit might actually come in handy. Chapter 3. The Missing Heirloom. The next morning, Tony woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his balcony. The sun streamed through the sheer curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. For a moment, he lay there, savouring the tranquility. Then he remembered where he was, and bolted upright. After a quick bath and a change of clothes, he opted for his least wrinkled shirt, though it still looked like it had been stuffed in a suitcase for 2 weeks. Tony headed downstairs. The smell of freshly baked bread and coffee wafted through the air, leading him to the dining room. Sally was already there, sipping a cup of hot coffee. She looked up as Tony entered, her expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. "You're late," she said. "I was about to send out a search party." "Sorry," Tony said, grabbing a thick slice of bread from the basket on the table. Before Tony could say any more, Don Raphael entered the room, his expression grim. Behind him trailed Javier and Isabella, both looking equally serious. Good morning, Don Raphael said, though his tone suggested it was anything but. I'm afraid something unfortunate has occurred. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. What happened? Sally asked. Don Raphael sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. A family heirloom has been stolen from my study. A golden amulet passed down through generations of the Castillo family. It is priceless. Tony's eyes widened. Stolen? As in, someone broke in and took it? Precisely, Don Raphael said, his voice tight with anger. The study was locked, and the amulet was kept in a secure display case. Whoever took it knew what they were doing. Sally leaned forward, her detective instincts kicking in. Do you have any idea who might have done it? Don Raphael hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the staff who were quietly setting the table. I would prefer not to make accusations without evidence, he said carefully. But it is clear that the thief is someone familiar with the estate. Isabella, who had been silent until now, spoke up. It's probably one of the staff, she said, her tone dismissive. They're the only ones with access to the study. Javier shot her a look. We don't know that, he said. It could have been anyone. Tony, sensing the tension, decided to change the subject. Is there anything we can do to help? Don Raphael's expression softened slightly. That's kind of you to offer. But this is a family matter. I've already contacted the local authorities. They'll handle it. Sally, however, had other ideas. As soon as Don Raphael left the room, she turned to Tony with a gleam in her eye. We're going to investigate? Tony groaned. Sal, we're on vacation. Can't we just, I don't know, drink wine and relax? Where's your sense of adventure? Sally said, grabbing his arm. Come on, Tony. This is our chance to be amateur detectives. How often do you get to solve a real-life mystery? Never, and for good reason, Tony muttered sarcastically. Their first stop was the study, which was now cordoned off by the local police. A stern-looking officer stood guard at the door, his arms crossed. No entry, he said in heavily accented English when Tony and Sally approached. Sally flashed her most charming smile. We're friends of the family. We just wanted to see if we could help. The officer shook his head. No entry, he repeated unmoved. Sally and Tony reluctantly walked down the hall, but they weren't ready to give up. We need to find another way in, Sally said. Another way into a locked room guarded by a police officer, Tony said, raising an eyebrow. Sure, no problem. I'll just whip out my grappling hook and swing through the window. Sally ignored his sarcasm. There's got to be a way. Maybe we can talk to the staff. They might know something. Tony sighed. Fine. But if we get caught, I'm blaming you. They made their way to the kitchen, where the staff were busy preparing lunch. The atmosphere was tense, and the moment Tony and Sally walked in, the chatter died down. Hi, Sally said brightly. We were wondering if we could ask you a few questions about the missing amulet. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, but one of the maids, a young woman named Maria, stepped forward. We don't know anything, she said quickly. Sally nodded, her expression sympathetic. We're not accusing anyone. We just want to help. Did any of you notice anything unusual last night? Maria hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. I thought I heard footsteps in the hall, she said quietly. But when I went to check, there was no one there. Tony and Sally exchanged a look. Footsteps? Tony repeated. What time was this? Around midnight, Maria said, but I could be wrong. It might have been nothing. Sally thanked her and led Tony out of the kitchen. Footsteps at midnight, she said thoughtfully. That's our first clue. Tony groaned. Great. Now we're sneaking around at midnight. This is exactly how horror movies start. Sally grinned. Relax, Tony. It's just a little detective work. What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, quite a lot. That evening, after a tense dinner, during which Don Raphael barely spoke and Isabella glared at everyone, Tony and Sally decided to put their plan into action. Armed with a torch and Tony's multi-tool, they waited until the house was quiet before creeping out of their rooms. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon streaming through the windows. Tony's heart pounded as they tiptoed toward the study, every creak of the floorboards making him jump. This is a terrible idea, he whispered. Shh, Sally hissed. We're almost there. They reached the study door, which was still guarded by the same officer. Fortunately, he appeared to be dozing in his chair. Now what? Tony whispered. Sally grinned. Now we improvise. She grabbed Tony's arm and pulled him down the hall toward a door marked Wine Cellar. The wine cellar? Tony said, incredulous. What are we going to do, drink our way to the truth? No, Sally said, rolling her eyes. There's a secret passage. Maria told me about it earlier. Tony stared at her. Maria told you about a secret passage. Why didn't you lead with that? Because it's more fun this way, Sally said, opening the door and descending the stairs. The wine cellar was cool and dimly lit, with rows of barrels and bottles lining the walls. Sally led Tony to the back of the room, where a large barrel stood against the wall. Help me move this, she said. Tony groaned, but complied, and together they shifted the barrel to reveal a hidden door. I can't believe this is actually a thing, Tony muttered as they stepped through the door and into a narrow, dusty passage. The passage led them to a small room filled with old documents and artifacts. In the centre of the room was a pedestal, empty except for a faint outline of dust, where the amulet must have once rested. This is it, Sally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The thief must have come through here. Tony shined his flashlight around the room, his unease growing. We need to get out of here, he said. Sally nodded, but as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them. Uh-oh, Tony said. You think? Sally replied, her voice tinged with panic. As they fumbled in the dark, trying to find a way out, Tony couldn't help but think that his survival kit might not be enough to get them out of this one. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Cellar. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the small, dusty room, leaving Tony and Sally in near total darkness. Tony fumbled with his torch, which flickered ominously, before finally staying on. The beam of light illuminated Sally's wide-eyed expression. Well, Tony said, trying to keep his voice steady, this is officially the worst vacation ever. Sally ignored him, already scanning the room for another exit. There has to be a way out, she muttered, running her hands along the walls. Secret passages usually have more than one entrance, right? I don't know, Sal, Tony said, shining the torch around the room. I didn't exactly major in secret passage architecture. The room was cluttered with old documents, crates and artifacts, all covered in a thick layer of dust. Help me look for a lever or a button or something, Sally said. Tony sighed but joined her. Focus, Tony, Sally snapped, though her voice was more anxious than angry. They searched in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Just as Tony was about to suggest they start yelling for help, Sally let out a triumphant cry. Found it, she said, pressing a hidden button. There was a loud click, and the wall behind them slid open, revealing the dimly lit wine cellar. Tony and Sally scrambled to their feet and hurried through the opening, breathing a sigh of relief as the wall slid shut behind them. That was too close, Tony said, leaning against a barrel. Sally shook her head. We're onto something, Tony. That room was full of old documents. There's got to be a clue in there. Tony groaned. Or it's just a bunch of dusty paperwork. Either way, I'm not going back in there. Before Sally could argue, they heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Tony's eyes widened and he grabbed Sally's arm, pulling her behind a stack of wine barrels. "Hide!" he whispered. They crouched in the shadows, holding their breath as the footsteps grew closer. A figure appeared in the dim light, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hat. He moved quickly, heading straight for the hidden door. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. "Who is that?" Tony mouthed. Sally shook her head, her eyes wide. The man pressed the hidden button, and the wall slid open once more. He stepped inside, and the wall closed behind him. "We need to follow him," Sally whispered. "That guy could be dangerous," Tony hissed. "Exactly," Sally said, "which is why we need to find out what he's up to." Before Tony could stop her, Sally darted out from behind the barrels and pressed the button again. The wall slid open, and she slipped inside, leaving Tony no choice but to follow. The hidden room was empty. "Where did he go?" Tony whispered, shining his flashlight around. Sally pointed to a narrow doorway on the far side of the room, partially hidden by a stack of crates. "There," she said. They crept toward the doorway, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. The doorway led to a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for one person. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were lined with cobwebs. "This is how horror movies start," Tony muttered as they made their way down the tunnel. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber, lit by a single flickering bulb. The man in the dark coat was there, rummaging through a pile of documents. Tony and Sally ducked behind a stack of crates, watching as the man pulled out a folded piece of paper and studied it intently. "What is that?" Tony whispered. Sally shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to find out." Before they could make a move, the man suddenly turned and headed back toward the tunnel. Tony and Sally froze, holding their breath as he passed by their hiding spot. Once he was gone, they let out a collective sigh of relief. "Okay," Tony said, his voice shaky. "Now, can we leave?" Sally nodded, but her eyes were already scanning the pile of documents. "Just give me a second," she said, grabbing a handful of papers. Tony groaned, but helped her gather as many documents as they could carry. They made their way back through the tunnel and the hidden room, finally emerging in the wine cellar. "Let's get out of here before someone else shows up," Tony said, leading the way up the stairs. They hurried back to Tony's room, where they spread the documents out on the bed. Most of them were old letters and ledgers written in Spanish. "Can you read any of this?" Tony asked, holding up a yellowed letter. Sally frowned, studying the handwriting. "Some of it. It's mostly about the vineyard's finances, but there's something about a family secret." Tony raised an eyebrow. "A family secret? That sounds ominous." Sally nodded, her expression serious. "I think this goes deeper than a stolen amulet. There's something Don Raphael isn't telling us." Tony sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Great. So now we're not just dealing with a thief, but a family conspiracy too?" Sally grinned. "Exactly. And we're going to get to the bottom of it." Tony groaned, collapsing onto the bed. "I knew I should have stayed home." As they pored over the documents, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that they were in over their heads. But with Sally's determination and his own growing curiosity, he knew there was no turning back now. The mystery of the Castillo Vineyard was just beginning. Chapter 5. A Body in the Vines. The next morning, Tony woke to the sound of shouting outside his window. He groaned, rolling over and pulling a pillow over his head. 5 more minutes, he mumbled, but the shouting only grew louder, and soon there was a frantic knocking at his door. "Tony, wake up!" Sally's voice was urgent, and Tony reluctantly dragged himself out of bed. He opened the door to find Sally standing there, her face pale and her eyes wide. "You need to see this," she said, grabbing his arm and pulling him down the hall. "What's going on?" Tony asked, still half asleep. "It's the foreman," Sally said, her voice trembling. "He's dead." Tony's grogginess vanished in an instant. "What? How?" "I don't know," Sally said. "But it's bad, Tony. Really bad." They hurried outside, where a small crowd had gathered near the edge of the vineyard. Don Raphael stood at the centre, his face a mask of shock and anger. Javier and Isabella were there too, along with several members of the staff. Tony and Sally pushed their way through the crowd, and what they saw made Tony's stomach churn. The foreman, a burly, surly man named Luis, was sprawled on the ground, his lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. A knife protruded from his chest, the handle glinting in the morning sun. The ground around him was stained with blood, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of it. Tony felt a wave of nausea and looked away, but Sally knelt down for a closer look. "Don't touch anything," Don Raphael said sharply. "The police are on their way." Sally nodded, her expression grim. "Do you have any idea who could have done this?" Don Raphael's jaw tightened. "Number, but I intend to find out." The police arrived a short time later. Tony and Sally watched from a distance as the officers cordoned off the area and began their investigation. "This is bad," Tony said, his voice low. "Really bad." Sally nodded, her eyes still fixed on the scene. "It's not a coincidence, Tony. The stolen amulet, the hidden room, and now this? There's something going on here, and we need to figure out what it is." Tony groaned. "Sal, this could be dangerous. Maybe we should just let the police handle this." Sally shook her head. "The police don't know what we know. We've got to keep digging." Later that afternoon, Tony and Sally found themselves in the kitchen, where the staff were gathered in hushed conversation. The atmosphere was tense, and the moment Tony and Sally walked in, the chatter died down. "We're sorry about Luis," Sally said, her voice gentle. "We know this must be really hard for all of you." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, but Maria, the maid who had spoken to them earlier, stepped forward. "Gracias," she said quietly. "Luis was difficult, but he didn't deserve this." Tony nodded. "Do any of you have any idea who might have wanted to hurt him?" The staff shifted uncomfortably, and Maria glanced over her shoulder before speaking. "Luis had disagreements with many people," she said carefully, "but lately he seemed especially worried. He kept saying he knew something he shouldn't." Sally's eyes narrowed. "Did he say what it was?" Maria shook her head. "Number." But he was scared. He kept looking over his shoulder like he thought someone was watching him. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. "Thanks, Maria," Sally said. "If you think of anything else, let us know." As they left the kitchen, Tony turned to Sally. "This is getting way too dangerous, Sal. We need to tell the police what we know." Sally shook her head. "Not yet. We don't have enough evidence. We need to find out what Luis knew." Tony groaned. "And how do you propose we do that?" Sally grinned. "We're going to search his room." Luis's room was a small, sparsely furnished space above the garage. The police had already been through it, but Sally was convinced they'd missed something. "What exactly are we looking for?" Tony asked as they rifled through Luis's belongings. "Anything that might tell us what he knew," Sally said, opening a drawer and pulling out a stack of papers. Tony sighed and continued searching, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding. He was about to suggest they give up when he noticed something odd about the floorboards. "Hey, Sal," he said, crouching down. "Does this look strange to you?" Sally joined him, running her hand over the floorboards. "It's loose," she said, prying it up with her fingers. Beneath the floorboard was a small compartment, and inside was a folded piece of paper. Sally unfolded it, her eyes scanning the contents. "What is it?" Tony asked. Sally's expression was grim. "It's a list of names," she said, "and amounts of money. It looks like blackmail." Tony's eyes widened. "So Luis was blackmailing someone?" Sally nodded. "And I think that's why he was killed." Before Tony could respond, they heard footsteps outside the door. Tony's heart raced as he and Sally exchanged a panicked glance. "Hide!" Sally whispered, shoving the paper into her pocket. They ducked behind the bed just as the door creaked open. Tony held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. The footsteps moved closer, and then there was a loud thud as something heavy hit the floor. Tony peeked out from behind the bed and saw a figure standing over Luis's desk, rifling through the drawers. It was Isabella. Tony's eyes widened and he ducked back down, his mind racing. What was Isabella doing here? And what was she looking for? After what felt like an eternity, Isabella left, closing the door behind her. Tony and Sally waited a few moments before emerging from their hiding spot. "What was that about?" Tony whispered. Sally shook her head. "I don't know, but I think we just found our next suspect." As they left Luis's room, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting in way over their heads. But with Sally's determination and the growing list of mysteries, he knew there was no turning back now. Chapter 6. The suspects gather. The discovery of the blackmail list in Luis's room sent Tony and Sally's minds racing. As they made their way back to the main house, they debated their next move in hushed tones. "Isabella was in his room," Tony said, his voice low. "That can't be a coincidence. She's definitely hiding something." Sally nodded, her expression thoughtful. "But why would she be involved in blackmail? She's Don Rafael's niece. She's already rich." "Maybe it's not about money," Tony suggested. "Maybe it's about power or secrets." Sally frowned. "Either way, we need to find out more. But we can't confront her directly. She's too smart for that." Tony groaned. "So what do we do? Follow her around like a couple of amateur spies?" Sally grinned. "Exactly." That evening, the atmosphere at dinner was even more tense than usual. Don Rafael sat at the head of the table, his expression stormy, while Isabella picked at her food, her eyes distant. Javier, usually the life of the party, was uncharacteristically quiet, and the staff moved around the room like ghosts. Tony and Sally exchanged glances throughout the meal, silently communicating their unease. When dessert was served, a flan that no one touched, Don Rafael finally broke the silence. "I want to thank you all for your patience during this difficult time," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "The police are doing everything they can to find out who killed Luis, and I assure you, justice will be served." Isabella set her fork down with a sharp clink. "Justice?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What do you know about justice, uncle?" Don Rafael's eyes narrowed. "Isabella, this is not the time—" "No, you're right," Isabella interrupted, standing up. "It's not the time. It's never the time with you, is it? Too busy playing the benevolent patriarch to see what's really going on." Javier stood up. "Isabella, stop," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't helping." Isabella glared at him, then at Don Rafael, before storming out of the room. "I'm sorry about that," Don Rafael said, though his voice was tight with anger. "Please, enjoy your dessert." No one did. After dinner, Tony and Sally retreated to the library, where they could talk without being overheard. "What was that about?" Tony asked, sinking into an armchair. Sally shook her head. "Family drama, obviously, but there's more to it than that. Isabella's hiding something, and I think Don Rafael knows it." Tony sighed. This is getting way too complicated. Maybe we should just tell the police what we found in Luis's room. Sally shook her head. Not yet. We need more evidence, and we need to find out who else is on that list. Tony groaned. How are we supposed to do that? It's not like we can just walk up to people and ask, "Hey, were you being blackmailed by the dead guy?" Sally grinned. Not exactly, but we can start by watching and listening. People have a way of revealing their secrets when they think no one's paying attention. The next morning, Tony and Sally decided to split up to cover more ground. Tony stayed in the house, keeping an eye on Don Rafael and Isabella, while Sally ventured out to the vineyard to talk to the staff. Tony's first stop was the study, where Don Rafael spent most of his mornings. He lingered outside the door, pretending to examine a painting while eavesdropping on the conversation inside. "I don't care what it takes," Don Rafael was saying, his voice low and angry. "Find out who killed Luis and put an end to this nonsense." There was a murmur of agreement, and then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. Tony quickly ducked into a nearby alcove, holding his breath as Don Rafael stormed past, his face like thunder. Once the coast was clear, Tony slipped into the study, his heart racing. The room was exactly as they'd left it, with the empty pedestal where the amulet had once rested. Tony scanned the room, looking for anything out of place, but everything seemed normal. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small leather-bound book on the desk. He hesitated, then picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was a ledger, filled with numbers and names, but one name in particular caught his eye. Isabella. Tony's eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at. "Blackmail payments," he muttered to himself. Before he could investigate further, he heard footsteps in the hall. Panicking, he shoved the ledger back on the desk and ducked behind the curtains just as Isabella walked in. She moved quickly, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for something. Tony held his breath, praying she wouldn't notice him. Isabella went straight to the desk, opening drawers and rifling through papers. She paused when she saw the ledger, her expression darkening. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath, slamming the drawer shut. Tony's mind raced. What was Isabella looking for? And why was her name in the ledger? Before he could piece it together, Isabella turned and left the room, closing the door behind her. Tony waited a few moments before emerging from his hiding spot. "This is way too much excitement for one day," he muttered, slipping out of the study. Meanwhile, Sally was having her own adventure in the vineyard. She'd managed to corner Maria the maid near the storage shed. "Maria, I need to ask you something," Sally said. "It's about Luis." Maria hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I've already told you everything I know." Sally shook her head. "I don't think you have. Luis was blackmailing people, wasn't he?" Maria's eyes widened and she looked away. I don't know what you're talking about." Sally reached into her pocket and pulled out the list they'd found in Luis's room. "We found this in his room. Your name is on it, Maria. What was he blackmailing you about?" Maria's face crumpled, and she sank onto a nearby crate. "It was my brother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He got into trouble with the law. Luis found out and threatened to tell Don Rafael unless I paid him." Sally's heart ached for the young woman. "I'm so sorry, Maria, but you're not the only one. Luis was blackmailing others too. That's why he was killed." Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I think Don Rafael knew about it." Sally's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Maria hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Luis was meeting with Don Rafael the night he died. I overheard them arguing. Don Rafael was furious." Sally's mind raced. If Don Rafael knew about the blackmail, did that make him a suspect? Or was there more to the story? Before she could ask more questions, they heard footsteps approaching. Maria quickly wiped her tears and stood up. "I have to go," she said, hurrying away. Sally watched her go, her mind buzzing with questions. When Tony and Sally reconvened in the library later that evening, they compared notes. "Don Raphael has a ledger with Isabella's name in it," Tony said. "I think it's connected to the blackmail." Sally nodded. "Maria told me Luis was blackmailing her and she overheard him arguing with Don Raphael the night he died." Tony's eyes widened. "So Don Raphael could be involved?" "Maybe," Sally said, "but Isabella's hiding something too. She was in the study, looking for something." Tony groaned. "This is like a soap opera. Everyone's got a secret." Sally grinned. "Exactly. And we're going to figure out what they are." As they sat there, poring over their notes and trying to piece together the puzzle, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that they were in way over their heads. The mystery of Castillo Vineyard was far from over. Chapter 7. The Midnight Chase. The library was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single lamp on the desk. Tony and Sally sat surrounded by stacks of notes, maps, and the blackmail list they'd found in Luis's room. "Okay," Sally said, tapping the list with her pen. "We know Luis was blackmailing multiple people, including Maria and possibly Isabella. Don Raphael knew about it, and he was arguing with Luis the night he died. That makes him a suspect." Tony nodded. "But Isabella's involved too. She was in the study, looking for something, and her name was in Don Raphael's ledger. What if they're working together?" Sally frowned. "Maybe. Or maybe they're working against each other. Either way, we need more evidence." "We'll have to get creative. Tonight, we're going to do some nighttime reconnaissance." Tony's eyes widened. "You mean sneaking around in the dark? That's a terrible idea." "It's the only idea we've got," Sally said, standing up. "Now, let's get ready." Later that night, Tony and Sally met in the hallway outside their rooms, both dressed in dark clothing. Tony carried his trusty torch and multi-tool, while Sally had a small notebook and pen tucked into her pocket. "Remember," Sally whispered as they crept down the stairs, "stay quiet and stick to the shadows." Their first stop was the study. Sally had convinced Tony that they needed to take another look at Don Raphael's ledger. They slipped inside, closing the door softly behind them. Sally went straight to the desk, opening the drawer where Tony had seen the ledger earlier. She pulled it out and began flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. "Anything useful?" Tony whispered, shining his torch over her shoulder. Sally nodded. "There are payments listed here, but they're not just from Luis's victims. Some of them are from Don Raphael himself. It looks like he was paying Luis to keep quiet about something." Tony's eyes widened. "So Don Raphael was being blackmailed too?" "Looks like it," Sally said. "But what was Luis holding over him?" Before they could speculate, they heard footsteps in the hall. Tony's heart leapt into his throat and he grabbed Sally's arm. "Hide!" he whispered, pulling her behind the curtains. They held their breath as the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, moving silently through the room. Tony peeked out from behind the curtain and saw Isabella's silhouette. She went straight to the desk, opening drawers and rifling through papers. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. What was Isabella looking for? After a few tense moments, Isabella seemed to find what she was after, a small, folded piece of paper. She tucked it into her pocket and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Tony and Sally waited a few moments before emerging from their hiding spot. "What was that about?" Tony whispered. Sally shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to find out. Let's follow her." Tony groaned, but followed Sally out of the study and down the hall. They kept their distance, sticking to the shadows as they trailed Isabella through the house. Isabella moved quickly, her footsteps barely audible on the polished floors. She led them to the wine cellar, where she paused to glance over her shoulder before descending the stairs. Tony and Sally hesitated at the top of the stairs. "This is getting way too creepy," Tony whispered. "Come on," Sally said, grabbing his arm. "We're not backing out, now." They crept down the stairs, their footsteps muffled by the thick stone walls. The wine cellar was dimly lit, the rows of barrels casting long shadows. Isabella was nowhere to be seen. "Where did she go?" Tony whispered, shining his torch around. Sally pointed to the back of the room, where the hidden door they'd discovered earlier stood slightly ajar. "There," she said. They slipped through the door and into the narrow passage beyond. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were lined with cobwebs. Tony shivered, though it wasn't just from the chill. The passage led them to the small room filled with old documents and artifacts. Isabella was there, holding the folded piece of paper she'd taken from the study, her expression unreadable. Tony and Sally crouched behind a stack of crates, watching as Isabella unfolded the paper and studied it intently. "What is that?" Tony whispered. Sally shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to find out." Before they could make a move, Isabella suddenly turned and headed back toward the passage. Tony and Sally froze, holding their breath as she passed by their hiding spot. Once she was gone, they let out a collective sigh of relief. "Okay," Tony said. "Now what?" Sally grinned. "Now we see what she was looking at." They hurried over to the spot where Isabella had left the folded piece of paper. Sally picked it up and unfolded it, her eyes scanning the contents. "It's a map," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A map of the vineyard with a specific location marked." Tony's eyes widened. "What's at the location?" Sally shook her head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." Before Tony could say anything, they heard footsteps in the passage. Tony's heart raced as he and Sally exchanged a panicked glance. "Hide!" Sally whispered, pulling him behind a stack of crates. They crouched in the shadows, holding their breath as the footsteps grew closer. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hat. Tony's eyes widened. It was the same man they'd seen in the wine cellar earlier. The man moved quickly, heading straight for the spot where Isabella had left the map. He seemed to realize the map was missing, because he let out a low curse and began searching the room. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, their minds racing. What was this man after? And how did he know about the hidden room? Before they could come up with a plan, the man suddenly turned and headed back toward the passage. Tony and Sally waited a few moments before emerging from their hiding spot. "We need to get out of here," Tony whispered. Sally nodded, but her eyes were already scanning the room. "Just give me a second," she said, grabbing a handful of documents. Tony groaned, but helped her gather as many papers as they could carry. They made their way back through the passage and the wine cellar, finally emerging in the main house. Chapter 8. A Cryptic Confession. The map Isabella had left behind burned a hole in Sally's pocket as she and Tony hurried back to their rooms. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft creak of floorboards beneath their feet. "We need to look at this map," Sally whispered as they slipped into Tony's room, closing the door softly behind them. Tony nodded, still catching his breath. Sally spread the map out on the bed, and they both leaned in to examine it. The map was hand-drawn, with intricate details of the vineyard and surrounding areas. A single red X marked a spot deep in the vineyard near the edge of the property. "What do you think is there?" Tony asked, his voice low. Sally shook her head. "I don't know, but it's clearly important. Isabella went out of her way to get this map, and that man in the cellar was looking for it too." Tony frowned. "Do you think it's connected to the amulet, or the blackmail?" "Maybe both," Sally said, her eyes narrowing as she studied the map. "We need to check it out." Tony groaned. "Of course we do. because sneaking around in the middle of the night isn't dangerous enough. Let's add treasure hunting to the list. Sally ignored his sarcasm, already folding the map and tucking it back into her pocket. We'll go tomorrow night. For now, we need to get some rest. Tony didn't argue. The adrenaline was wearing off and exhaustion was setting in. He collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. This vacation is supposed to be relaxing, you know. Sally grinned. Relaxing is overrated. Mysteries are way more fun. The next morning, Tony and Sally woke to the sound of raised voices coming from downstairs. They exchanged a glance before hurrying out of their rooms to investigate. In the foyer, Don Raphael was arguing with Isabella, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. You have no right to interfere, Isabella shouted, her face flushed with anger. This is my vineyard, Isabella, Don Raphael shot back, his voice cold. You will respect my authority. Javier stood nearby, looking uncomfortable, while the staff hovered in the background, pretending not to listen. What's going on? Tony whispered to Javier as they approached. Javier sighed. Family drama. Isabella wants to modernize the vineyard, but my uncle is resistant to change. They've been arguing about it for weeks. Sally's eyes narrowed. Is that all they're arguing about? Javier hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. But something's been off lately. Isabella's been secretive, and my uncle's been, well, more controlling than usual. Before they could press further, Don Raphael noticed them and abruptly ended the argument. We'll discuss this later, he said to Isabella, his tone final. Isabella glared at him but said nothing, storming off down the hall. Don Raphael turned to Tony and Sally, forcing a smile. I apologize for the disruption, he said. Please, enjoy your breakfast. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance but said nothing. They followed Javier to the dining room, where a spread of pastries, fruit, and coffee awaited them. As they ate, Sally leaned over to Tony and whispered, We need to talk to Maria again. She might know something about that map. After breakfast, Tony and Sally found Maria in the kitchen, helping to prepare lunch. She looked up as they entered, her expression wary. Maria, can we talk to you for a minute? Sally asked, her voice gentle. Maria hesitated, then nodded, following them out into the courtyard. The morning sun was warm, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. We found something last night, Sally said, pulling out the map. Do you know what this is? Maria's eyes widened as she studied the map. Where did you get this? Isabella had it, Tony said. Do you know what it's for? Maria hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. It's a map to the old well. It's been sealed off for years, but there are rumours that something valuable is hidden there. Sally's eyes lit up. Valuable? Like the amulet? Maria shook her head. I don't know, but Luis was obsessed with it. He used to talk about finding it, but he never did. Tony frowned. Why would Isabella be interested in it? Maria hesitated again, her voice dropping to a whisper. Isabella, she's not what she seems. She's been trying to take control of the vineyard for years. Some say she'll do anything to get it. Sally's mind raced. Do you think she killed Luis? Maria shook her head. I don't know, but she's dangerous. You should be careful. Before Tony and Sally could ask more questions, Maria hurried back inside, leaving them alone in the courtyard. Well, Tony said, that was cryptic. Sally nodded, her expression serious. We need to check out that well. Tonight. That evening, Tony and Sally prepared for their nighttime expedition. They dressed in dark clothing and packed a small bag with supplies, a torch, a rope, and Tony's multi-tool. Why do I feel like this is a terrible idea? Tony muttered as they crept out of the house. Because it probably is, Sally said, grinning, but that's what makes it fun. They followed the map through the vineyard, the rows of grapevines casting long shadows in the moonlight. After about 20 minutes, they reached the edge of the property, where the map indicated the well should be. They found it hidden behind a thicket of bushes, its stone rim overgrown with vines. "This is it," Sally said. Tony peered over the edge. "How are we supposed to get down there?" Sally pulled the rope out of her bag and tied it securely to a nearby tree. "We'll climb down. Easy." Tony groaned. "Easy for you, maybe. I'm not exactly an expert climber." The two friends lowered themselves into the well, their hearts pounding as they descended into the darkness. The well was deeper than they expected, and the air grew colder the further down they went. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, damp chamber. Sally shone the torch around, revealing a narrow tunnel leading away from the well. "This way," she said, crawling into the tunnel. It eventually opened into a larger chamber, where they found a small wooden chest. Sally's eyes lit up as she opened the chest, revealing a stack of old documents and a small, intricately carved box. "What's in the box?" Tony asked, his curiosity overcoming his fear. Sally opened it carefully, revealing a collection of jewels and gold coins. "It's a treasure," she said, her voice filled with awe. But before they could celebrate, they heard a noise behind them. Tony turned, his heart leaping into his throat as he saw a figure standing in the entrance to the chamber. It was Isabella. "I should have known you'd find it," she said, her voice cold. Tony and Sally exchanged a panicked glance. They were trapped. Chapter 9. The Truth in the Cave. The flickering beam of Sally's torch illuminated Isabella's sharp features as she stood in the entrance to the chamber, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "Isabella," Sally said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "What are you doing here?" Isabella's lips curled into a cold smile. "I could ask you the same question. This is private property, you know." Tony swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "We were just exploring. We didn't mean any harm." Isabella raised an eyebrow, her gaze flickering to the open chest and the treasures inside. "Exploring? Huh? You have a funny way of doing it." Sally took a step forward, holding up her hands in a placating gesture. "Look, we didn't come here to steal anything. We're just trying to figure out what's going on. Luis was killed, and we think it's connected to this." Isabella's expression darkened at the mention of Luis. "Luis was a fool," she said, her voice bitter. "He thought he could blackmail his way to the top, but he underestimated the people he was dealing with." Tony's eyes widened. "So you admit it? You were involved in the blackmail?" Isabella laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Involved? I was the one who started it. Luis was just my pawn, but he got greedy and he paid the price." Sally's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. "You were blackmailing your own family? Why?" Isabella's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "This vineyard has been in the Castillo family for generations, but my uncle has run it into the ground. He's too stubborn to change, too stuck in the past. I tried to convince him to modernize, to expand, but he refused. So I took matters into my own hands." Tony frowned. "By blackmailing him?" Isabella nodded. "I needed leverage. I needed to force him to step aside. But Luis got greedy. He started blackmailing others, including me. He thought he could control me, but he was wrong." Sally's eyes narrowed. "So you killed him?" Isabella's expression hardened. "I didn't have a choice. He was going to ruin everything. But I didn't kill him. My uncle did." Tony and Sally exchanged a shocked glance. "Don Rafael?" Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella nodded. "He found out about the blackmail and confronted Luis. They argued and things got out of hand. My uncle stabbed him, then came to me for help. Together, we covered it up. Sally's mind raced as she tried to process the revelation. But why are you telling us this? You could have just let us go, and we'd never have known the truth. Isabella's smile returned, though it was tinged with sadness. Because I'm tired of the lies. I'm tired of pretending. I wanted you to know the truth, so you could understand why I did what I did. Tony shook his head, his voice filled with disbelief. You're not going to get away with this. We'll tell the police everything. Isabella's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. Before Tony and Sally could react, Isabella pulled a small knife from her pocket and stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. You should have stayed out of this, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Tony's heart raced as he and Sally backed away, their eyes fixed on the knife in Isabella's hand. The chamber was small, and there was nowhere to run. Isabella, think about what you're doing, Sally said, her voice calm but firm. This isn't the way. Isabella hesitated, her grip on the knife tightening. For a moment, it seemed like she might back down, but then her expression hardened, and she took another step forward. Tony's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. He glanced at Sally, who gave him a subtle nod. They had to act fast. As Isabella lunged forward, Tony grabbed a loose stone from the ground and threw it at her, distracting her just long enough for Sally to tackle her to the ground. The knife clattered to the floor, and Tony quickly grabbed it, holding it out of reach. Isabella struggled against Sally, but Sally held her down, her voice firm. It's over, Isabella. You're not going to hurt anyone else. Isabella's struggle slowed, and she finally went still, her face buried in the dirt. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, I just wanted to save the vineyard. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with the weight of the truth. They had uncovered the mystery, but it had come at a cost. After securing Isabella with the rope they had brought, Tony and Sally made their way back to the surface, their minds racing with what they had learned. They knew they had to tell the police everything, but they also knew it wouldn't be easy. So as they emerged from the well, they were met with the sight of Don Raphael and several members of the staff, their faces filled with shock and confusion. What is going on here? Don Raphael demanded, his voice filled with anger. Sally stepped forward, her voice steady. We know the truth, Don Raphael. We know you killed Luis, and we know Isabella was involved in the blackmail. Don Raphael's face paled, and he took a step back, his expression filled with fear. You don't understand, he said, his voice trembling. I had no choice. Luis was going to ruin everything. Tony shook his head, his voice filled with disbelief. That doesn't justify murder. You and Isabella need to face the consequences of your actions. Don Raphael's shoulders slumped, and he nodded, his face filled with regret. You're right. I just wanted to protect my family. As the police arrived and took Don Raphael and Isabella into custody, Tony and Sally stood together, their hearts heavy with the weight of the truth. They had solved the mystery, but it had come at a cost. As they watched the police leave, Sally turned to Tony, her voice soft. We did the right thing, Tony. Tony nodded, though his expression was somber. Yeah, but it doesn't feel like a victory. Sally placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with determination. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, but it's still worth it. Tony sighed, but he knew she was right. They had uncovered the truth, and they had brought justice for Luis. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was the right one. As they walked back to the house, the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the vineyard. The mystery of Castillo Vineyard was finally solved, But Tony and Sally knew their adventure was far from over. The stakes had just gotten a lot higher. Chapter 10. The Final Twist. The morning sun bathed the Castillo Vineyard in a golden light, but the beauty of the landscape did little to ease the heavy atmosphere that hung over the estate. The staff milled about in hushed clusters, their faces etched with shock and confusion. Javier stood apart from them, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Well," Tony said, breaking the silence, "that was intense." Sally nodded, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off a chill. "It's not exactly how I imagined this trip ending." Tony glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Sally hesitated, then nodded firmly. "We did. Luis deserved justice, and Don Rafael and Isabella needed to face the consequences of their actions. It's not perfect, but it's the right thing." Tony sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I guess. It just feels messy." Before Sally could respond, Javier approached them, his face pale and his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My uncle, my cousin, how could they do something like this?" Sally placed a hand on his arm, her expression sympathetic. "I'm so sorry, Javier. I know this must be really hard for you." Javier shook his head, his eyes filled with disbelief. I never thought they were capable of something like this. My uncle always seemed so honorable." Tony frowned, his mind racing. Something about Javier's reaction didn't sit right with him. "Javier," he said slowly, "did you know about any of this? The blackmail? The treasure?" Javier's eyes widened and he took a step back. "What? No, of course not. How could you even ask me that?" Sally shot Tony a warning look, but he pressed on. "It's just, you've been acting kind of strange lately, and you're the one who invited us here. It's a little suspicious, don't you think?" Javier's face flushed with anger, and he clenched his fists. "I invited you here because I thought it would be fun. I didn't know my family was involved in all of this." Sally stepped between them, her voice firm. "Tony, stop. Javier's been through enough. We don't need to accuse him too." Tony opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Sally's face made him think better of it. He sighed and nodded. "You're right. I'm sorry, Javier. I didn't mean to accuse you." Javier's shoulders slumped and he nodded, though his expression remained tense. "It's okay. I get it. This whole thing is a mess." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Sally spoke up. "What happens now? With the vineyard, I mean." Javier sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. My uncle was the one who ran everything. Without him, I don't even know where to start." Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. "Maybe we can help," Sally said, "at least until you figure things out." Javier managed a small smile. "Thanks, I appreciate it." Over the next few days, Tony and Sally threw themselves into helping Javier manage the vineyard. They worked alongside the staff, learning the ins and outs of winemaking, and doing their best to keep things running smoothly. It was hard work, but it was also a welcome distraction from the chaos of the past week. One evening, as they sat on the terrace watching the sunset, Sally turned to Tony with a thoughtful expression. "You know, this place is really special. It's a shame everything got so messed up." Tony nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, but maybe it's not too late to fix it. Javier seems like a good guy. If anyone can turn this place around, it's him." Sally smiled. "I think you're right. And who knows? Maybe we'll come back someday and see how it's doing." Tony grinned. "As long as there are no more dead bodies or secret treasure hunts, I'm in." Sally laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Deal." The day of their departure arrived too soon. Javier drove them to the airport, his mood noticeably lighter than it had been in days. "I can't thank you enough for everything," he said as they stood outside the terminal. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Sally smiled, pulling him into a hug. "You'll be fine, Javier. Just take it one day at a time." Tony shook his hand, his expression serious. "And if you ever need help, you know where to find us." Javier nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, both of you. You're good friends." As they boarded the plane, Tony and Sally found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened. It had been a whirlwind of a trip, filled with mystery, danger, and unexpected twists. But through it all, they had stuck together, and that was what mattered most. "You know," Tony said as the plane took off, "this might have been the craziest vacation of my life, but it was also kind of fun." Sally grinned. "Told you, mysteries were more exciting than relaxing." Tony laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, but next time let's stick to something a little less life-threatening, okay?" Sally nodded, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Deal. But just so you know, I'm already planning our next adventure." Tony groaned, but he couldn't help smiling. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure. Life with Sally was never boring. Epilogue. Homeward bound. Back at college, Tony and Sally quickly fell back into their routine, though their Spanish adventure was a frequent topic of conversation. They regaled their friends with tales of hidden treasure, secret passages, and dramatic confrontations, embellishing the details for maximum effect. One evening, as they sat in their favourite tea shop, Sally handed Tony a postcard. It was from Javier, featuring a stunning photo of the Castillo Vineyard at sunset. "He says things are going well," Sally said, her eyes scanning the message on the back. "He's modernising the vineyard just like Isabella wanted, and he's invited us back next summer." Tony grinned, flipping the postcard over to admire the photo. "Sounds like a plan, but this time let's make it a real vacation. No mysteries, no dead bodies, no treasure hunts." Sally laughed, raising her cup of tea in a toast. "Deal. But just so you know, I'm keeping my detective skills sharp. You never know when they might come in handy." Tony clinked his cup against hers, his smile widening. "Here's to that." As they sat there, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of their college town, Tony couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. No matter what the future held, he knew one thing for sure. With Sally by his side, he was ready for anything. The mystery of Castillo Vineyard was behind them, but their adventures were just beginning. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories